Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This passage appears 2 times in year B of the Common Lectionary this year in that 3-year cycle, today and also in Lent. It clearly was seen by the folk who picked the passages for the lectionary as being so important to understand Jesus that they put it in there twice. And I must have agreed with them, because going back and looking over my database of all of the sermons that I've preached, when it comes around twice every 3 years, I've preached on it twice every 3 years. It's not surprising. It's a passage that's filled with meaning, and it's got a whole bunch of sermons in there. I originally had planned on focusing on that final section of it, losing one's life, and that's what the sign was out on the marquee outside. But if you noticed up on the screen, it was different. It is different. Who do you say that I am? I went back and as I do every week, and I looked at all of the sermons that I've preached on this passage, and about 75% of them, and again, preach on it twice every 3 years, about 75% of them were on that end of it, losing your life. It's a tricky sermon to preach, that one. Mark's audience, when they heard that, the folk who were there with Jesus when he spoke those words the first time, for them it was a literal understanding. When he spoke of taking up your cross and following him, that was the culmination of a death sentence. It was literally losing one's life for Jesus. How do we identify with a passage like that when Christianity has become domesticated and so identified with the dominant culture that sometimes we can't see the difference between our culture and Christianity? Indeed, folk who say that the United States is a Christian nation, they're not doing that because they're trying to be disingenuous. They actually believe it. They're unable to see the difference between being a Christian and being an American. The rest of the time, about 25% of those sermons, I preached on the rebuke of Peter by Jesus. Took that in the direction of something like the times we stand in Jesus' way. But there isn't one sermon in there that picks up on the beginning of that exchange with Peter. Who do you say that I am? Not one. And as I struggled with the passage this week, that kind of presented itself in a couple of ways. The first was that I've been rereading Doug Miller's book, Your Jesus is Too Small, The Collapse of Christian Character. I'm kind of glad Sandy's not here today. She might be embarrassed, or maybe not, I don't know. But in his book, Doug began with that question. Who do you say Jesus is? And he argues that the way we answer that question gives shape not only to our theology, but more importantly to the way that we live out our Christian life in the world. The way our character is shaped is founded on who we believe Jesus to be. That's pretty much what's going on with Peter. Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers quickly and emphatically, you are Messiah. Jesus didn't argue with him, but instructs Peter to keep it on the down low. He knew that the common understanding of that role as Messiah wasn't quite what he wanted people to understand about himself. And so he goes on with his disciples and the folk there to correct it. He says, I will undergo rejection. I will experience pain. Ultimately, I will experience execution and be raised in 3 days. It was not the definition that most folk would have held in that time and place for what the Messiah was. And it certainly wasn't the one Peter had. Peter, not wanting to embarrass Jesus, kind of pulls him aside and says, let me correct you, Jesus. You're missing the point, Jesus. The Messiah is one who comes in power and triumph and majesty. It's the one who throws off the Roman rule at the edge of the sword. If Rome equals military might, well, Messiah comes with even more of that. And it's not only military might, it's spiritual might, because God comes and fights literally on Messiah's side. He, the Messiah, would be the one to reestablish Israel as the political force in the Middle East and the center of the then known world. The Messiah is the one who destroys enemies and rules with an iron hand. And we can imagine, if that's the picture one holds of Jesus, how that plays itself out in the lives of his followers. Indeed, we don't have to imagine. We see it. When the Roman guard come to arrest Jesus, Peter draws a sword and he attacks. He knows who the enemy is. He is ready to respond with deadly violence because his understanding of Messiah is one who wields deadly violence. He's expecting bloodshed because that's what he thinks Messiah does. And he's ready to participate. He's ready to act in that way because that is the picture that he holds. That is his answer to the question, who do you say I am? Well, Peter says, you're the one who wields the sword, so I will wield the sword. And the other disciples aren't far behind, are they? They too see this picture of Messiah, this identification of Jesus as one who wields power. James and John, Jesus, when you come in your kingdom, let us sit, one on the right hand and one on the left. And I can imagine they're jockeying to see which one gets which spot. We can almost hear their minds going as they ask that question. We've put up with all of this Son of Man has no place to lay his head stuff. Now we want the payback. We want our spot. And the rest of the group, we know they too had argued over which one of them was the greatest. And Jesus, knowing they didn't get it, responds to them, well, the greatest is the one who's the least. And we can see them scratching their heads and going, well, never mind. They lived with Jesus. They had traveled with Jesus. They had listened to Jesus teach. They had watched Jesus heal the sick. They had watched as he welcomed the children, as he touched women, as he reached out to those who were on the margins, as he welcomed lepers into his presence, as he even raised the dead. They had seen all of that, and they still didn't get it. And so Jesus corrects this misunderstanding that Peter has by publicly shaming him. Peter, you are Satan. You are opposing God. You are holding up human values instead of God's values because you have the wrong picture of who Messiah is. And if you get the answer wrong, you live your life as a follower of Jesus wrong as well. You need the right picture. That's what Doug says. Who do you say Jesus is? Who do I say Jesus is? Doug goes on to divide his book into two sections. In the first section, he has 18 popular takes on the answer to that question, who is Jesus in our culture, in the church, that he says degrade Jesus and contribute to the collapse of Christian character in our society. I'm not going to list them, but it's important to note that the majority of those he calls degrading images turn things upside down so that Jesus becomes our servant, the one who makes my life better, the one who meets my desires, the one who fixes things for me, who stands against my enemies. And if our understanding of who Jesus is equals our own private genie who makes things better for us, from so small as making sure we get the best parking space in the parking garage to as big as winning the lotto, if that's our picture of Jesus, we end up being shallow, materialistic, self-centered people. Doesn't that sound familiar to us? If our picture of Jesus is a prosperity, sugar daddy Jesus, a magical thinking Jesus, any of those kinds of pictures, that's where we end up. And they are popular pictures in our culture because they feed our cultural norms. There are some others that are less directly self-centered, but they still serve to underscore positions of privilege and power. I've got two theological books open on my desk at this point. That's really unusual for me. I tend to do one at a time. And the second one's also a local author, David Moore, who wrote a book. His title is Making America Great Again, Fairy Tale, Horror Story, Dream Come True, a Challenge to the Christian Community. If you don't know David, you've probably seen him around. He's the African-American guy with the really big fro. And it's a very personal book that David writes, and he shares a lot of his personal experiences and his personal stories, and then puts them in the context of the history of the American church, and plays out the way that we in the American church have subverted the image of Jesus into one that gets tied into white supremacy. And I can't do it justice to kind of talk about that, except to say that it's a wonderful book, and especially if you know anything about David and have had any interactions with him, it's really worth reading. But again, he plays out how, if the church has come up with this vision of Jesus, how easy it is for those of us in the church to turn our backs on those in need. And one example that he gives is he talks about a church that is ready and excited and willing to send off missionaries and folk to go do positive work in places where people with black skin live, and then turn their backs and close their eyes to the people in their own communities who have similar needs but are too close. In the second part of Doug's book, he lists 16 images that he says exalt Jesus, and the ones that he says we need to embrace if we want to live lives of true Christian character. And again, I'm not going to list them all at this point, but as you read through them, you see that almost all of them tie in to that early Christian hymn that Paul quotes in his letter to the Philippians. Have this mind in yourself that was also in Christ Jesus, who poured himself out for others. And Doug, as he lists each of those issues, he says, if that's the kind of picture we have of Jesus, that becomes the call for us as followers of Jesus. They lead us as Jesus poured himself out to pour ourselves out, to give of ourselves for the other, to make things better for the other, to turn our enemies into friends, those who are far off, who are foreign, who are different from us, into our neighbors. That they lead us inevitably to social justice on behalf of the poor and the marginalized. David would remind us that we have often turned in a very different direction. They call us to love as we wind our way through the maze of life with all of its political, economic, social, ecological, and personal spheres. And every single one of them is impacted by the way we answer the question. Doug tells us, and I think Jesus would tell us, and certainly Mark would tell us, that it is the way we answer that question, who do you say Jesus is, that determines the way we live our lives. He pours himself out, and so must we. Now, Doug ends his book with humility, and we must hold our pictures with humility as well. Doug says the answer is never complete. Who do you say I am? The picture, he says, is never exalted enough. We cannot build a construct of who we understand Jesus to be that is quite as wonderful as he actually is. And so we work at it continuously. And even when we get close to understanding who he is, we still at times fall short of living the way that he has called us to live. We can imagine that Jesus is the one who pours himself out for the entire world and still fall short of pouring ourselves out. But as Paul says, we press on towards the prize. We continue to do our best to live our lives as followers of the one who pours himself out for us. Who do you say he is? Who do I say he is? When we get that answer at least close to right, we find ourselves living the lives that we're called to live. Amen.